Right. Okay. Thank you very much, everybody. I'm going to get going. I'm sure that there are some more people coming here today. But anyway, thank you, first of all, very much for coming along today. It's a pleasure to have everybody here virtually. And it's a very great pleasure for us to have with us today Professor Chunshen, or as he is billed on the poster, Chunshen, if you prefer that English way around. I personally prefer the Chinese way, but Professor Zhu is not only a leading scholar in the field of translation studies, and particularly in the Chinese sphere, of course, but he's also been a friend and mentor to many of us here today. And speaking personally, I remember way back, I was interviewed in 2001 for a job at City University of Hong Kong. And at the job talk, there was a very serious group of scholars sitting around the table, very, very long faces, or maybe they were just bored by my presentation. But right the way opposite me at the other end of the table was Chunshen, smiling broadly. He was the only person who was smiling. And I remember that very well. It was a very sort of warm and welcoming smile, although he did, I remember, follow it up with a very killer question. So first impressions, I think, are very important. And that impression of a scholar who was both full of good humor and also real intellectual rigor has remained with me ever since then. Once I joined CityU back then, Chunshen was always willing to offer this younger, greener early career scholar some very sound advice, good conversation, and right the way down to some of the practicalities which as a young scholar you have no idea about. For example, writing a grant proposal. I remember him lending me a copy of one of his successful proposals. And that was a lifesaver. And again, I still remember that to this day. So reading his works, and I'm sure listening to this talk tonight, I'm reminded of many of those conversations that we had back then at CityU. Well, after a little bit of personal reminiscence, let me go to the formal introduction. Professor Zhu, of course, has been teaching translation. I nearly wanted to say since time immemorial, but since 1982 anyway, so a very long time. First at Fujian Normal University, then at the National University of Singapore, and then at City University of Hong Kong, where, as I said, we met. And he's currently Professor of Translation Studies at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, Shenzhen. He's also Honorary Research Fellow at our very own Center for Translation here today. And he's also Adjunct Professor at Xi'an Jiaotong Liverpool University. Unsurprisingly, he's also on the board of a number of journals, including the Chinese Translators Journal, the Interpreter and Translator Trainer, and he's also an international advisory board member for the Translator, all very prestigious journals. He gained his PhD from Nottingham in 1993, and really ever since then has been publishing scholarly work on translation in the translation studies field, and indeed beyond in areas such as Chinese poetry. But in addition to his scholarship, he's also very much a practicing translator as well. And he's produced various works, including two book-length works, Oscar Wilde's De Profundis, and then a forthcoming book, Logan Pearson Smith's All Trivia. And I'm sure that many of us have also seen his poetry translations as well. Well, Professor Zhu's last talk at the center here, if I remember rightly, was, I think, in 2016. when he presented his work on Martha Jones' pushing hands approach to translation studies. And I remember that to demonstrate his point, he began with a full Tai Chi display, complete in full Tai Chi gear. And as you may know, Professor Zhu is also a Tai Chi master. So this online mode here today, of course, precludes a repeat of that display. But I know, nevertheless, that we will be in for a highly stimulating and exciting presentation called Language, Knowledge and Experience, Studying Translation Positively. So without further introduction, please join me in very warmly welcoming Professor Zhu Chunshen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert, for your very kind, generous, and emotional introduction. It brings back all those memories of the time when we were working together. And and of course, I should thank the center for inviting me to give this talk, and of course, for this very good and challenging suggestion that I talk about the book that was published last year on translation studies. And I hope I can somewhat, come up with some ideas or skimming over what has been discussed in the book and get some key notions, key arguments to share with us. And of course, I'm open to questions and to challenges, to criticisms, so that we can work together to study translation more positively. Okay. And now, as I promised in the poster, I would like to start with some basic hypotheses about the relationship between language, knowledge, and experience. Now, if we relate language to human beings, rather than taking language as an abstract system of signs, we immediately will understand that language functions. But we would like to press further for this question. Language functions to do what? And my answer is, it functions to create a text. And then the text should function. And again, a text functions to do what? A text functions to make believe. So this is something quite different, I hope, from what we have conventionally conceived of the text. It functions to make believe, making you believe that it has certain meaning for you to make out. And that this meaning is about certain knowledge. It is meant to impart. So behind the text, there is a person who means to impart some knowledge. And to make meaning is therefore to make knowledge. But how are you being made to believe that you are making meaning and acquiring that certain knowledge? Have we ever looked back on ourselves when we go through a text for its meaning, so to speak? And this how is what we call discursive experience. It is an experience of meaning or knowledge making. And what does it imply for our translation? First, translation in this light is discursive experience. That is, to translate a text is to represent the translator's experience of being made to believe. We are not talking about transferring information. We are not talking about, say, upgrading a language, or we are not talking about challenging an ideological agenda or so on and so forth. We are being very personal, if you like. We are talking about a translation is a representation of the translator's experience of being made to believe. And you may think, oh, I may not believe. Okay, hold on to this question. We'll deal with that in a moment. And the target text is to make the target reader believe in a similar manner to how the source text has made the translator believe. A typo here. In this journey of making believe, the meaning that the author believes the source text holds is realized as the meaning the translator believes she has made, and this believed meaning is to be held in the target text for the target reader to make and believe. So we are not talking about a text has meaning. It holds meaning. So this meaning we may attribute to a text is its meaning potential to be realized. And the realization of this meaning potential has a different story. We are going to see. So meaning making or knowledge acquisition in translation is a text induced, textually accountable, bi-culturally conditioned discursive experience. And this experience is cognitive in nature. So it's an experience of cognition and realization, coming to know, to realize. And this experience is undergone by individual readers. Individual is the key word here. And what we have assumed to be applicable to the above description of reading, writing, and translating in general is equally applicable to our undertaking of translation studies. So what we have understood from this perspective about reading, writing, and translating itself actually is equally applicable to our description of translation studies, or how we study translation. And this takes us to Lefebvre's description of 3 childhood diseases. And among these 3, the pivotal one, I would argue, is this not reading what other people have written. The other one two, to me, are knock-on diseases. Always reinventing the wheel, because you don't read other people's writings. So chances are you will be reinventing the wheel and then ignoring its own history without reading what has been written before you. How could you familiarize yourself with the history of translation or translation studies? And this was discussed in section 1.1. And our key claims here is hence, no conceptualization or characterization of translation is final and complete. No theory can fully capture the complexity of translation. People may pay lip service to such claims, yet deep in their minds, quite a few of them I have met implicitly at least harbor the ambition of creating a master theory to put an end to the whole story. Okay, so I make this as one of the key claims. And the development of translation studies should be a never-ending paradigm expansion rather than zigzagging turns and twists. Right? We are talking about paradigm. We are talking about paradigm expansion, not paradigm shift. And in the minor note of that shift, you're talking about turns. And the divide between linguistic approaches and non-linguistic approaches is artificial, unwise, and harmful. We can see that the study bifurcated when authors came up with, the claim of a non-linguistic turn in the study. And that what follows from that bifurcation, and as we are operating in the field in which linguistics is much underrepresented or deliberately or incidentally neglected. And I would say that this divide between the two is artificial, unwise, and harmful. And a paradigm expansion is to address this. And a revisit to Bourdieu's language theory, which is mainly concerned with the speech act theory, convinces us that one can find in functional linguistics a theoretical basis and a methodological framework for making the social phenomena of cultural production, translation included, linguistically more accountable. Okay. Because Bourdieu didn't include in his purview Halliday's functional linguistics, while he was taking exception from the formal kind of linguistics. And then when he was talking about speech act theory, actually this theory was reduced, especially in pragmatics, to illocutionary act. And that is leaving out perlocutionary act. And then this, and with little attention to that illocutionary force, which should have registered a more significant role in our perception of human communication in real life. And this also justifies our modeling of meaning making on the basis of systemic functional linguistics and speech act theory. You may like to know that Bourdieu and Wittgenstein have come under that umbrella term of conventionalism. And another author, I guess it should be Urian House, has put Halliday or Halliday theory under conventionalism as well. So the three must have a lot to share or overlap in their theorization of language. And as we move on, in the first chapter, I took on board Milton Friedman's positive positive economics. And Wolfgang Iser's conceptualization of critical theories, which I found very, very informative and instructive. Especially Iser's distinction between theory and discourse. This is key to my conception of translation theorization, which we will come back in a moment. And we propose a positive approach to translation and translation studies, positive translation studies. And when some of my friends saw this positive translation studies, they were wondering whether I was coining a new name under the surname of translation, as if I were trying to mark out a territory or to start a new school. I must say that this is not what I would like to do, and this is not what I'm driving at. What I am talking about is still translation studies, but a different approach to this translation studies. I know the Chinese language is very generous with name making. You know, you can just add a surname and then a xue or ology to any term, and you are seemingly creating a new translatology, if you like, and it will be the father or mother of that school. No, this is not my intention. My attention is fixed on translation studies. So so I have to describe what I mean by being positive and positive translation studies. And this positive translation is pure as a methodology of theorization. It's pure from any ideological agenda. And it is explorative, descriptive, and analytical, explanatory, and predictive rather than prescriptive as a mode of argumentation, as opposite to deterministic discourse. You know, by Iser's definition, discourse is deterministic. It tells us what to do, what not to do, how we should live the life, okay? While theory is explorative. It explores new grounds, you know, and it describes what it explores. It explores and it explains rather than telling, rather than judges what is right, what is wrong. And predictive is from Friedman, which we will explain a little bit more in a moment. As a conception, it consists of a body of hypotheses or theories. If you like, you can add discourses representing a tentative but systematic accumulation of knowledge about translation rather than embodying an overarching principle. It's not that to embody an overarching principle which discourse would like to uphold. That you should do this, you should do that. No. And from this positive translation studies, predictions can be derived and explained. Explanation is key, is vital, which are about, predictions are about the consequences of a particular action and not necessarily the taking of the action itself. You are not coming here to predict Mr. So-and-so is going to take that action. No. What you predict is if someone takes this action, what will be the consequences? And of course, it is up to this someone to decide whether he or she should take this action. And then we skipped 5 and 6. And as discursive apparatus, it furnishes a filing system to accommodate an ever-expanding complementary multiplicity of hypotheses or theories about translation, providing a platform for their co-presence and competition for prominence. All theories are coming together co-present in this arena of translation studies, and they are competing for prominence. It's not that one should, win out at the expense of another theory. And through such focused competition and appropriation, the theoretical structure of translation studies is continuously and positively defined and refined to assert its epistemological value of anthropological significance. We are talking about human beings. So whatever we are doing, it must be anthropologically significant. So be positive is to be empirical. Inclusive and centripetal. Centripetal means looking into translation rather than taking translation negatively, quote unquote, through various terms. you can take on board any theories that you deem relevant to translation, and you have to justify your doing so by improving the existing theorization of translation. Not just, creating a theory for the theory's own sake. It has to be critically engaged with the existing literature on translation so as to assert your status as a theory that with new insight, new relevance to advance our understanding of translation to begin with. So, to be positive is to be participating in critical engagement through which theoretical systems involved establish their relevance. No critical engagement, no legitimacy of a theory. For me, it is as simple as that. In positive translation, it is theorization rather than siding with any discrete theory that matters. And its application is to critically engage various theories that have been found to be relevant to the phenomenon of translation. Often on my course of translation theories, a student will come up and ask, what theory should I use? And I would say to them, apart of what you have read about translation, if you happen to be taking any psychology course, and you find something interesting in relation to translation, by all means, include that. Incorporate that in your in your discussion. And with this, this model of structure of meaning is making meaning and the triggering of discursive experience. And this is informed by systemic functional linguistics and speech act theory. And these are three meta functions proposed by SFL. Ideational function expressing what you say. Interpersonal function expressing your attitude in saying what you are saying in relation to your role and position in the communication. The textual function, the organization of your saying in relation to its context to enable the first two functions. And a speech act theory. Locutionary act, saying something properly. Illocutionary, the intention of saying something in a particular manner by a certain social culturally endorsed force, i.e. intention to secure uptake, invite a response, etc. And perlocutionary act, a social, non-conventional and non-linguistic act. The first two are linguistic acts. When the saying has resulted in certain effect upon the hearer's feelings, thoughts, or actions. The actual effect, e.g., convincing, persuading, surprising, or misunderstanding, can be one intended or unintended by the speaker. And based on these three, we proposed a three-dimensional model of meaning making. And these three dimensions are the compositional, the transactional, and the experiential. The compositional, the logical mechanism of meaning making in text formulation, where the ideational and illocutionary overlap in this dimension, that those two overlap. The interaction, the author's or speaker's intention to communicate in a particular manner as facilitated and governed by both linguistic and social cultural conventions. You say it in this manner is governed by your understanding, not just in linguistic norms, but the social conventions. And the experiential is the realization of the textually organized meaning as a perlocutionary effect experienced by the reader. And here, the experiential is the most important thing I have elaborated in the book. And the key points are the effect may be the same as, similar to, or different from the author's intention. Meaning making in this dimension is therefore dynamic and open-ended. When we talk about Eugenides' dynamic equivalence, I will ask how you define dynamic. And here, dynamic is in the domain of experience. Being open-ended yet textually accountable, the experiential bestows an aesthetic quality on the text as a structure of meaning. Now, in the book, we discuss the relationships between these three dimensions from a generic view. And then we also try to tackle that complex issue of form and substance. Substance is Dewey's term, conventionally we would say content, form and content. And this is based on John Dewey's theorization about art as an experience. And the translation in this way is a discursive experience in three dimensions. Meaning or knowledge is something to be dynamically made, experientially made. Okay. In other words, any perceived equivalence in meaning is something to be produced by translation rather than presupposed by it. Translation is therefore a textual operation of constructing comparables rather than equivalence. And this is from Ricoeur. The model of SOM, structure of meaning, provides an operational framework for source text comparison to detect and depict their comparabilities. And here, chapter 3, we are talking about how structure can be can translate into experience. And in section 3.2, we have a very brief overview of what we have understood about translation. Here, various binary conceptions were mentioned for comparison with the three-dimensional one of SOM. And in this section of 3.3, we are dealing with the sense and the meaning, reviewing the distinction between meaning and sense. So we propose a distinction between meaning making, that is the primary and experiential mental process, and a sense making, that is a secondary and a deliberative mental process to make judgmental sense of what has been discursively experienced. Okay, there are two layers. First, you have to experience the text so that you have something you can make sense of. distinction between meaning making and sense making. These two are very different notions. This provides a counterbalance to the general drift away from the experiential to the intention. We have been talking about authors' intentions, translators' intentions, but seldom, to the best of my reading, my knowledge, seldom have we talked about the reader's experience. No judgmental sense making is possible without a meaning made in the first place as its object. In reading the source text, the translator as interpreter always undergo a self-sensory process of sense-making, accompanying the experiential meaning-making, by which the meaning made is to be verified or falsified, believed or doubted, endorsed or suppressed, doctored or redacted. In verbalizing her interpretation, the translator as a writer may repair or weed out the elements that may not make desirable, desired, or permitted sense in the light of her personal sensibilities or the ideology of the sponsor institution. Okay. And the dynamics of meaning making, Engender's conception of moment of concretization. Reading a sentence is an open-ended experience, a moment-by-moment concretization to fill out the places of indeterminacy in the words. Every word is not, no word has a fixed meaning, as the dictionary tries to convince us or to make us believe. No, in every word, there are places of indeterminacy. So a moment we encounter a word is a moment of concretization to fill out this in places of indeterminacy, so that the sentence can realize its meaning in the reader's experience. And the reader's understanding of the words in the sentence is being constantly updated, modified, or even refuted until the last moment when the reading reaches the end focus of the sentence information structure. This is not from Engender, it's from a systemic functional linguistics, the information structure and the focus, focal information, so on and so forth, i.e. the accumulation point where the meaning of the sentence is fully developed. This point actually creates an expectation for further updating by the subsequent sentences. So moment by moment of concretization for the translator. If as a translator you wish to share your moment by moment experience with your readers, then to what extent will you incorporate in your rendering your feeling out of the places of indeterminacy in the schema of the text world, in your target text? To what extent you are going to do the filling out? Or will you leave those perceived places as indeterminate as they are in the source text by deconcretizing your perception so as to allow your readers to experience what you have experienced by undergoing their own concretizations, moment by moment, as the target text unfolds itself. All this boils down to these seemingly innocent questions, which are actually not only linguistically, but also socially, culturally, and ideologically meaningful. What to say, when to say it, how to say it. And I provided a tryout. If you are interested, you can go to the book and try that out to see how a text is turned into experience. And furthermore, in that chapter, we conduct some experiments with focus management in translation. We took on a linguistic text in translation. Why? Because we can assume that it is free of any ideologically loaded intentions. Okay. And it is homogeneous in author's identity, translator's identity, and readership. On the other hand, we took on the opening sentence of The Old Man and the Sea and the Chinese translations. We discussed them and analyzed them. And then we come back to the linguistic texts to re-examine it in terms of management of information focus and the discussion and meaning making as discursive experience of aesthetic quality to realize a structure of meaning in its three dimensions is a perlocutionary act that is textually accountable in terms of the placement of focal information. Remaking of meaning in translation as a process of creating comparables can never be a mechanical operation of meaning transfer. No. What is more interesting for translation theorization is the discrepancies a rendering may display than the sameness, if any, between the source and the target text. We are interested more in differences rather than sameness. Because such discrepancies are meaningful and can be accounted for in terms of cognitive, historical, social, ideological, or linguistic disparity. We are not here talking about the translator's language proficiency. We are leaving that out. Or as manifestations of purposeful foreignization or domestication, resistance or manipulation, or simply creativity or even subversion of the target systems, certain conventions. What is more interesting, okay, and in chapter 4, the sentence as unit of translation. We need some operational unit. And here we have to distinguish between the text and the sentence. And we provide a definition of unit of translation. I may read it out. A UT is the smallest segment of the source text, which can be translated as an independent and integrated meaning entity in relation to other segments of the text. whereas its linguistic composition is analyzable on levels ranging from the morpheme to the sentence. Its textual function is realized in the experiential domain, where its structure of information brings about a discursive experience that contributes to the overall discursive experience the text eventually creates. If translation is to produce a target text in that mirrors or comparable to the source text as experienced by the translator, then the UT is normally matched in terms of structured information function experience correlation rather than grammatical categorization. Now, we are not talking about, okay, the subject has to be translated as subject, or the subject has been translated as an object. No, this is not the purpose. We are more interested in information structuring beyond the grammar. And for this purpose, we have to identify a unit's textual integrity. Within the frame of textuality, for a unit to contribute to text formulation, it should play the following three roles. In correspondence with the three dimensions of the text structure of meaning to assert its integrity as a textual unit. The role of syntactic barrier, the role of information carrier, the role of stylistic marker. And the syntactic barrier ensures grammatically appropriate as the basis for textual cohesion and coherence. Okay, here, ensuring the barrier should be grammatically appropriate. That is, its grammatical appropriateness. And as such, it should be the basis for cohesion and coherence. Two of the 7 features of textuality. And the information carrier conveying an amount of information to render the ideational content interpersonally significant as a coherent message. So here we are not talking about sentence, we are talking about message that can be seen as relevant to a plausible intention in a perceived situational context. So intention has to be perceived in a context to establish its relevance. And the stylistic marker is the most important thing in this framework. It contributes, a stylistic marker contributes by choice of words and the choice of word order, not only to the acceptability of the text as a member of its genre, but also to its textual individuality that sets it out in the intertextual network of the genre or culture. Genre is more closely related to culture. And culture in this is defined as an intertextual network, so as to generate a unique experience in the reader. Textual individuality is one of the key points we have to bear in mind. So systemic as stylistic marker, given the fact that the author's elocutionary intention and the text's perlocutionary effect on a reader is not necessarily identical, a stylistic marker has to be defined from the reader's perspective. Okay. What does this mean? It means that the text choice of words and word order should be perceived by a reader as contributing to the shaping of her discursive experience. However, the author has intended to be a stylistic marker, if the reader fails to see that, this element fails to be a stylistic marker, so to speak. In the process of translation, the translator is all but an interim meaning maker, whereas her target reader is the final one. So translation has got an extended leg in meaning making, while a original source text creation just between the author and the reader. In translation, there is an interim reader or author, that is the translator. The sentence as UT. A sentence enters the textual building process with its textual integrity as a syntactically independent, but not textually autonomous entity. Its independence is endowed by a cognitively meaningful old-new information flow, semantically secured by lower level textual units, such as words. And here we have got two case studies. One is Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, the opening sentence, and the other is a postcard text concocted by Michael McCarthy. And discussion and conclusion. What makes text translation different from sentence translation is the emphasis on what? On a textual perspective from which a part of the text can be assessed for its contribution to the whole text in generating a specific discursive experience. Any theme rim or topic focus management of audio information structuring in the target text is to reconstruct a sentence textual integrity in the hope of achieving an expected effect via the target text as a structure of meaning. The target text's effect is independent of the source text effect or the translator's intention, even though the target text information structure may appear largely identical with the source text. By staying open to the realization of its own experiential effect on an individual reader, the target text is supposed to induce moment by moment and unit by unit an intellectually and emotionally satisfactory narrative resolution as a reward, to the reader that contains a new but relevant understanding of the world. And chapter 5, this is the most difficult chapter, and I feel in the whole book, which took me 1 year to complete. Not to mention that before that, there has already a journal paper published in 1996 in Target. And this is informed by Halliday's functional grammar. And it concentrates on pre-modifications because the Chinese language doesn't have that much, post-modification as we have seen in the English language. And a fully fledged sequence of pre-modification in both English and Chinese is diactic, numerative, epithet, classify, and head. That is, those two splendid old electric trains. Halliday's example. And the diactic indicating the head's situational or contextual relevance to the text. Numerative indicates the head's quantity, including ordering with an ordinal numeral to make it countable, as it were. Interpersonal epithet. There are two kinds of epithet. Interpersonal, expressing the authorial attitude about the head referent, hence subjective and affective, and extrinsic to the head referent. Ideational epithet, directing the reader's attention to a particular, apparently more perpetual and objective feature of the head referent, selected for defining or delimiting purposes. Classifier, classifying the head referent as a member of a subset by naming one of its features as its classifying quality. This is different from the Chinese term unit or measure words. Among the modifiers, modification proceeds to involve modifiers of successively less identifying potentials and indicating increasingly permanent properties of the head referent. That is, the more to the front, the more prominent role it plays to identify the head relevant. And the closer it is to the head word, the more it indicates a permanent property of the head referent. The attitudinal interpersonal epithet carries the most noteworthy information because it's attitudinal. Key arguments. Presence of modifier entails selection, and the selection entails evaluation. You pick up a modifier from the world to modify, to describe or to identify or to define the head relevant. You are choosing, you are selecting, and the selecting entails your evaluation. Hence, all modifiers are directly or indirectly suggestive of an authorial attitude. The more heavily a head is modified, the more attention it attracts. Any features that may have been expressed by a diactic, numerative epithet can be presented as a classifier to classify the head relevant. Okay, anything before the classifier can be, turned into a classifier for classification purposes. In Chinese, the demarcation between the epithet and the classifier is marked by de or di. For instance, 白色的衬衫啊，白色的衬衫，白衬衫。Okay, 白衬衫 indicates a category. 白色的 not a category, not a classifier. It can express an attitude. It can indicate a quality. 新鲜的蔬菜 as against 新鲜蔬菜，慢慢的走 as against 慢慢走。What is viewed as applicable to attribute modification is applicable to adverbial modification as far as attention management is concerned. And information distribution and attention management, key points. As syntactic barrier, a modifier is optional. You can choose to modify or not to modify. As information carrier, a modifier grounds the transitivity in a broader context to facilitate discourse development, augmenting the transitivity with the various news of the sentence that support narration with the details to establish the head reference, cognitive validity, and discursive relevance. As stylistic marker, a modifier maintains the story's vividness and authenticity to create experiential involvement on the reader's part. All external modifiers at the sentence level can be internalized into the semantic makeup of a word. Of a word, we got semantic meaning here. And then structure of meaning in the word is the meaning area times contextual conditioned pragmatic value. So it's three-dimensional, cubic. As we can see here, bookcase, book modifies case is a morpheme. And then under book, we got printed, fastened, writing, modifying pages. So it's semamic modification. And the case, container, that's the head, semamic head for keeping or protecting things. That's semamic modifier. And from morphemic to semamic modification, looking into a morpheme. Further in, man is a one morpheme word. We can see that singular, adult, male, human. And in Chinese, we got singular, that's rather optional, adult, male, human. So they are not always matching, you see. And the semantic development, following this, we can identify semantic development is by adding or shedding an internal modifier. As we can see, mouse, 鼠标, or 鼠标器, mouse. But this meaning development in English is metaphorical because it involves the altering of the internal head. That is, mouse ceases to be a rodent. It becomes a device. And in Chinese, if we use the term 滑鼠, sliding mouse, it is metaphorical as well. And you can apply this in explaining metaphor translations or replacing a word, a source text word with another word. And why this is the case. And because we have identified skewed correspondence between the English and Chinese language. False and pseudo-morphemic modifiers. False morphemic modifiers. Tornado, 龙卷风, dragon roll wind. This is false. We can't see any long, any dragon here, for instance. And the pseudo one, 煤油, coal oil, paraffin. This is may is true modifier. As it classifies the oil, but 柴油, firewood oil, is a pseudo one because it doesn't say anything about the diesel oil. This is pseudo. And you can see 老婆啊, 老外啊, so on and so forth. All right. So and following on that, we offered 3 case examples to further elaborate the distinction and its implications for translation. This study shows that modification is not only related to grammatical application, cognitive necessity, or communicative affability, but also to discursive felicity that contributes to orchestrating discursive experience by managing the distribution of reader attention. That the more external a modifier is presented, the more attention it will command, and the more the head is foregrounded between interpersonal and ideational epithets, between epithets and classifiers. Conversely, the more internal a modifier is, the more subtle or delicate an impact it may have on the shaping of a discursive experience. And chapter 6, we are talking about repetition and the signification in translation. A student once came to me saying that she had been told by her teacher that when you see repetitive words in the source text, you may like to try to use a different word for variation's sake. I think why? I asked why. Certainly not every repetition has to be, wiped out so that we seem to be producing a more colorful source target text. And in this case, we provide a review of the relevance between SFL, text linguistics, and scope theory. Vertical translation unit in particular. And the key points, key argument, based on the apurposive nature of literary texts and the literary translation, the literary writer-translator purposefully remains purposeless, thus keeps the text created open to all purposes. In this way, a literary text becomes relevant to individual readers' experiences in more than one way, for more than one era, and in more than one culture. And we are talking about, we provide a critique on some, notions or arguments unfriendly to linguistics. For instance, what kind of linguistics? Anytime we encounter this kind of argument against linguistic approaches, we may like to ask ourselves, what kind of linguistics we are talking about? Okay, And then again, we take on some arguments against the use of literary texts in the study of translation. Why not? Okay. So, and here, the discussion is informed by Ron Carter and Walter Nash's characterization of literariness. And here, a definition of vertical translation unit. It's a hyper unit, whereas they themselves are not rank bound. That is, it could be a word, a sentence, an image, or whatever, you name it. With each unit manifested in various linguistic or non-linguistic elements that can occur at any level, anywhere in the text. If we connect these elements, we get chains or networks, which from a bird's eye view, give the impression of vertical units. All right, very neat definition. And this is a phenomenon of repetition. And now we take on, we borrowed a notion leitmotif from literary studies. And our definition, a combined definition from, more than one, dictionary of literary terms. A leitmotif operates within the textual contour of a work of literature in the form of a repetitive series of, e.g., a verbal phrase, an idea or subject, a set description, a complex of images, or an event or incident. So it's not rank bound. As such, leitmotif is textually more concrete than motif or theme that operates intertextually as a general concept or doctrine. Motif, 我们经常中文译成母题啊。Like a unifying thread, a leitmotif helps consolidate the textual structure of the work at both cohesion and coherence levels. Cognitively speaking, it may hide behind any repetition that helps unify a work by potentially recalling its earlier occurrence and all that surround it. In this way, a leitmotif can serve as a lead in interpreting the dominant theme of the work. And we, again, here we provide two case examples to illustrate unaccountable variations and the discussion. And the leitmotif as vertical translation unit. And in this connection, we found that some descriptions of the so-called translation universals actually failed to explain the phenomena we have on hand, such as reader consideration, scopus-driven adaptation, no need to count instances, simplification of the translation language, cultural hegemony, not now this typo again, hegemony or accommodation, agenda-governed manipulation. And following on that, we have got these key observations. If the fundamental purpose of literary translation is to pursue a certain effect, then this effect is an effect of a perlocutionary and experiential nature. such an effect is not so much convention governed as text generated, individual based, and beyond the control of either the author or the translator. Second, it is the experiential at the experiential level of perlocutionary act that the apurposive nature of literary translating, and indeed of any forms of artistic creation, is to be perceived. It is this apurposiveness that distinguishes the translation of literature pursuing an artistic agenda from the translation of literature following a commercial or partisan one. An apurposive mode of literary translation appreciates the individuality and the sovereignty of the source text and upholds the individuality and the sovereignty of the target text it produces. A literary target text is not meant to serve any specifically defined social purposes or functions. And the conclusion, a more constructive and positive approach as presented in this chapter should shed new light on both literary and non-literary translation in terms of textual accountability, elocutionary intentionality, and a social culturally conditioned realization of a perlocutionary effect on the reader's discursive experience. And then chapter 7 is about iconicity. And what does iconicity mean? Simply put, it's form miming meaning. So linguistic in nature is concerned with the language in general, whereas literary studies are interested in the language of specific text. Words as names demonstrate strong arbitrariness, and the syntax appears arbitrary too in arranging words into utterances. But manifestation of arbitrariness varies from one language into another. 语言的任意性啊。It is in textualization, the turning out a text, that iconicity is realized as realized to mark the individuality of a text as a syntax structured piece of narration. Iconicity points to a creative superstructure that makes a speech or text experientially suggestive. To recognize an iconic structure, a reader, critic, or translator has to be motivated to perceive certain resemblance between form and content. So the onus is on the reader. By extension, critic or translator. The motivation has more to do with the reader's willingness to cooperate, their openness and sensitivity, than with the author's intention. Here, we are not talking about author's intention. We are talking about the reader's willingness, openness, and sensitivity. And that's why students are studying translation. We are researching translation. We are training translators to be more sensitive. That's all. For translators, it is the source text individuality that matters in their deliberation about the desirability and the feasibility of retaining, amplifying, reducing, or deleting the iconicity recognized in the source text. in their creation of a comparable target text with its own individuality. So here, the translator may decide to retain or amplify or reduce or delete an iconic structure that has been recognized, underline this word, in the source text. If you do recognize that, you may still deleting or amplifying or whatever, but this is not informed operation. And in doing so, the translator, in an informed way, the translator should bear in mind the individuality of the target text. Key observations: form, function, and effect. As stylistic marker, iconicity facilitates the realization of multiple artistic effect. The iconic form enhances communication by textually enacting the story it tells. The enactment evokes mental representations of the happening in the story. Okay. These mental representations take place in the reader's mind. And the two kinds of foreignization. Here we are going to discuss Wang Meng Ye De Ye, two sentences, no, two passages. Now, before that, we are talking about two kinds of foreignization. The horizontal foreignization taps into other languages for its articulate energy, for in Davies' term. You tap other languages. This is the conventional notion of foreignization in the translation literature. And the vertical one, which I propose here, dips into its own language's historical storage of textual resources for its articulate energy. For instance, a Chinese text may dip into its classical textual resources for its articulate energy, and it comes out as a foreign, quote unquote, text to its contemporary readership. Often we have neglect this foreignization in this direction. Both would appear foreign for the text contemporary native audience. And we analyze, a passage of short sentences. And then the second case study, the iconicity in a long sentence. And there are, this is the key point, key argument. To recognize and appreciate syntactic iconicity, we have to get beyond the value-laden Europeanization or foreignization versus domestication. When a sentence appears somewhat unnatural or translation-like, and to be or not to be iconic in translation, this is the key issue. And here we compare the published translations of Wang Meng's sentences with a translation we propose for comparison as in the experimentation. Key observations. In both literary writing and translation, an innovative textual maneuver is by definition foreign to the general public's collective reading experience and beyond the purview of its contemporary critical paradigm. It is for the critics to catch up and capture its stylistic nuances so as to provide informed explanations as constructive references for readers and writers in general, and in our case, for translators in particular. Iconicity urges the translator to get over the utilitarian conception of form as passive container for content and to become aware of its positive role in meaning making as discursive experience. A positive and constructive paradigm of translation criticism with a textually accountable explanatory power will help the translator to get her practice in perspective. Conclusion. The acceptability of iconicity in translation has little to do with the author's or the translator's intention, but depends on how its textual formation can induce a cooperative, iconic interpretation of the text and reward the effort with a satisfying discursive experience. Because iconic structures tend to involve a more energy in processing. Linguistic inquiry into iconicity may appear to be a science. To adopt an iconic presentation or not in writing or translating, and when, where, and how to adopt it should be a scientifically informed art. For critics and translation scholars, syntactic iconicity provides an interface between form and content, and function and effect. Iconicity is significant for developing a holistic approach to writing, translating, and criticism beyond the binary labeling of foreignization and domestication. The anchor that keeps the openness of discursive experience and democracy of interpretation from drifting into freewheeling anarchy is the text, an autonomous verbal work of art that calls for and deserves close reading in both translation and translation criticism. Close reading, by the way, is something much needed and often neglected in our study of translation. In chapter 8, the final one, discusses how deceptive the language of a text can be, and any conflict that can be traced in the receiver's experience when the text is seen to be faithfully, quote unquote, rendered. And we start with a discussion of situation, culture, and text reproduction. And we argue that skill training has to be related to situation perception. That is, we have to relate skill to translation. And basic claim is that a skilled language user is one who is able to apply the acquired skills in producing a an utterance with a view to achieving a certain intended purposes in a particular situation. And we make that claim, we are obliged to define what we mean by situation. And a situation is a historical event governed by cultural conventions of the time, in which certain objects of the society of the time are present and certain activities of the participants from the society take place. And the perception of society, again, we have to define it. Synchronically, every society is perceived vis-a-vis parallel societies in other cultures. This is conventional. We have been doing this all the time. Diachronically, every society is a distinct period in the history of its own culture. We must be aware that the Tang Dynasty as a society is very different from the society we are living now. And if you like, the Tang Dynasty as a society is of a different culture from the culture we are embracing or we are operating under at present. And now you've been talking about culture. And then what's your definition of culture? Now, this asking for definition is my habit. If anyone talked to me about culture, cultural studies of translation, I would first of all ask for the definition of their definition of culture. Basically, culture is what tells humans from animals. It points to primarily to human communities' collective mode of behavior. That is, their ways of doing, seeing, saying, and thinking about things to manage their corporeal existence skillfully to their satisfaction. This takes us, I'll relate this to skill and key observations. This collective mode of behavior can be more specifically deemed as a collective mode of making tools. Including using tools to make new tools. As an artifact, a tool not only embodies its maker's elocutionary intention, but also effects a perlocutionary experience in its user beyond its physical being, thus acquiring its spiritual being. All right. If you have any doubts about this, just think of an Apple iPhone as against, for instance, my Samsung cell phone, okay? And you can see more clearly its spiritual implications or its spiritual being. Its primary materiality and secondary spirituality makes a tool a cosmologically meaningful sign in its semiotic fullness. Why cosmologically meaningful? Because we are going to talk about spirit. We are going to talk about divinity. And the form from tool making to sign making, basic observations. Tool making is sign making that is both instrumental and intellectual or spiritual. Culture not only points to humanity, but also differentiates diachronically one historical society from another and synchronically one community from another. Interpersonally, culture serves as a reference system by which conformity and the individuality of each person's behavior in a given situation becomes distinguishable. And a text as sign, basic arguments. A text as a tool to transmit information is a primary sign, instrument. For a text to be a secondary spiritual sign, it is its language that matters. The information it carries is all but a means, or rather a pretext, both a text prior to the text or an excuse for producing the text, to mobilize language in naming and gathering things in a specific order to formulate a message and to create a discursive experience. And cultural awareness. In translation, even the factual information remains the same, the language is changed, right? You agree or not? Communicated in a new language or new linguistic being must be a new mental being, following Walter Benjamin. The mental being communicated in the language of the target text belongs to the translator. It comes not from consuming the source text as a primary sign, but from the translator's discursive experience of it as a full sign in a particular translation, particular situation, where the reading, interpreting, and writing take place. And then here we have 10 parameters to delineate a situation. And I would like to draw your attention to Q6. Who hears it besides the intended listener? This is not often mentioned in our literature. And who disseminated it? Not necessarily the intended listener, you know. An overhearer may do the job. And number 10, what becomes of it after being disseminated? Here, the speaker's elocutionary intention matters little. It is the perlocutionary effect on the audience that matters. And with this, we are coming to, examining 桂林山水甲天下. And we have a review of the historical situation in which the source text was produced. And then the situation, the text is translated for a present day purpose. And a critique and a discussion. How has the target text language deceives its producer? All right. There is a parody taking place. In the translation models on East or West, home is best, by replacing home with Guilin. This is by no means an innocent, linguistic replacement. You just ask yourself. The information is carried, okay, but what mental being is communicated in the target language with the replacement of home? If you are coming to us saying that your home is the best in the world. What does that mean? So conclusion, strictly speaking, it is the translator's mental being instead of the source text authors that is communicated in the language of the target text, a mental being resulting from her experiential engagement with the source text. Being cross-lingual is being cross-societal and cross-cultural. The target text is not to be consumed as a primary sign, but also experienced as a full sign by participants in a social situation, sustained by a mode of text sign production, different from the situation of the source text. That is, the source text operates under a different culture, which means this culture operates on it by a different mode of text production. And the target text is subject to another culture, that is another mode of text production. And all this is discussed in the chapter itself. The study of translation as an academic discipline is therefore a positive, liberal program of research and education, rather than a passive, parochial one of skill training. As research and education, it is to advance our understanding of ourselves and of the world. And now here this is a production of a translation is not only a technical exercise, but more importantly, a historically situated intellectual event in which all social forces interact in an attempt to project a desirable discursive experience. Whether they succeed or not, that's a different matter. But by this perception of translation, we argue that translation is to advance. Translation studies is to advance our understanding of ourselves and of the world. And thank you for your patience and listening. Okay, that's all from me for tonight.
Right, thank you very much indeed, Chunshen. And I think that might have been me causing the technical glitch at the end. Very glad anyway that didn't interrupt. Many thanks indeed. It was a fantastically rich and erudite presentation, and very positive one as well, because you're arguing very much for incorporating difference and having difference without any debate or conflict. And I also like your metaphor of the filing cabinet as well, to sort of file all these different things in orderly form. So thank you very much. Now we're coming up towards time, but I think we can squeeze in perhaps one or two questions. If you do have questions, you're welcome to put them in the chat. I noticed we've got a couple there, or you can simply raise your voice, but perhaps we can deal with maybe one of these first. That's an enormous sounding question. Chunshen, which of those would you like to take? Would you please elaborate on theorization? You want to take that one on?
Okay.
In relatively quick terms, if that's at all possible.
Theorization is different. It's a process. contemplate translations phenomena, and you try to get into it to derive from your observation something more general, that is a process of generalization, and test it by applying it to similar situations for its validity and efficiency. And theorization is different from any existing theory. You take theories in your process of theorization. So you may end up producing a new theory, and this new theory immediately enters other people's process of theorization. Have I answered your question? So it's always a positive engagement.
All right, thanks a lot. Shall we maybe take
Stylistic marker.
Yes, okay.
Okay, this is textual. It has something to do with reader response. Okay. And it has something to do with the recipient. But it is textually accountable. That is, when you are reading a text and you feel that at certain juncture, then you feel the click, all right? And you ask yourself, why? I feel something unusual. In a sense, I feel worked up. I feel excited. You ask yourself why this is the case. Mind you, this is my question since I was a primary school boy. Why something can be so interesting. And for you, this is a stylistic marker. And when you are, unfortunately, a translator, this can serve as a kind of signposts in your design of your target text, right? So I'm not saying it's irrelevant to reader response, or it's not, but I won't go wholesale to those two notions.
Thanks. The next one. Yeah, you can read it, I think.
So, sorry to interrupt. When you meant to say stylistic marker rather than linguistic marker?
No, a linguistic marker belongs to syntactic marker. It's a kind of.
Got you.
All right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Okay. All right. Thanks. The next one. So, if the TT is independent of the ST, as you put it in chapter 4, could we say that translation can be boldly creative to be digestible to the target cultural readers?
Okay. Now, okay, here. That's been down to earth. How often we would read a translation alongside the source text? If we are not paid as a teacher or as a researcher or as a scholar, and we don't have that curiosity to compare the two languages to texts, how often we would read one text alongside the other? All right? This means in nature, a text, any text is independent. All right? And we have to see that. And a translation has to fare in its own context. You can't hide behind the fame or reputation of the source text. And you can't blame the source text for anything that is found to be wanting in the target text, right? And then this doesn't mean that you have to be boldly creative or not. You know, this logistically, they are not created. Even if you don't think a translation is independent, you can be as bold as you like. You can be creative as you like. That's why textual accountability is the anchor. And then here, the logic is that be bold, be creative does not necessarily mean that the target text is more digestible. Okay. And if you hold on to this, you owe us a definition of digestibility. What do we mean by digestibility? All right.
Okay, let's move to a couple more who we haven't yet heard from. I'd like to move to this Yen Li. Dear Professor Zhu, what's your idea on the smallest segment of meaning for translation? Thank you.
And what's your idea on the smallest segment? Now, you know, in chapter 5 about modification, you can go as deep as the tiniest meaning unit hidden in the morpheme. All right, but for translation's sake, you know, I would put it at the sentence level. That is, the smallest segment for translation is a sentence. And this is supported by Halliday, supported by Austin, and supported by engender, you know. And then it's marked by period. In English, full stop. How can you say that this stop is full? All right? Because you reckon that the meaning here is full in its own right. And in this sense, you are creating an expectation for the reader to go on to the next sentence. Right? I don't know whether I have answered this question or not.
That'll do. I think let's take the next one. This Wang Xiaohui, this one. If we say translation is comparable, then what role do the translators play in the translation process? Is it by readers' discursive experience or translators' mental being?
All right. First, comparable or comparables identified between the two texts. And if this is one thing, this for translation studies. And if you are talking about translation practice, and of course, translator is the key factor, you know, like it or not, according to Walter Benjamin, you know, your mental being lives in the language, not through, in the language of your target text, as much as the author's mental being is living in the source, in the language of the source text. Then you may argue, then where is the source text author? Mind you, a translator's mental being is different from the translator's mental being as an ordinary person, because at this moment, the translator's mental beings already being enriched by her experience, discursive experience of the source text. So this is a new version of the mental being of the translator. All right. So there are, this question actually encompasses more than one, you know, issues. And then or anything we call meaning in a text is, as engender would say it, held in readiness to be realized moment by moment of concretization on the reader's part. Hence, however beautiful your intention is, it has to be realized by the reader, on the reader. In a sense, it'll be materialized as a text, as a sign with its semiotic fullness. Right?
All right, and then this one here, since you mentioned the meaning making, is it an open experience which is constantly updating? Do we have any means to measure or to evaluate the experience transferred in translation practice?
Now, I have been thinking about this as well. That's why we came up with that modeling, three-dimensional modeling. And we are not here to pin down that dynamic, lively experience of reading. Okay. We are not going to do that. And meaning itself is evolving. Experience itself is ongoing. We can trace that once it is penned on paper, but I don't think there is any mechanical means to measure as if we are now testing, COVID-19 cases. You've got some antigen thing at home to see whether you got 1 or 2 bars on that tiny device, right? This is not, humanistic, science would drive at.
Maybe we can take one more. We do actually have one back up here, which we skipped in the interest of time, but maybe we could finish off with this one. How does positive translation contribute to translation studies and translation practice? That's probably a huge question to ask at the end, but maybe it will wrap things up nicely tonight.
All right. First, it argues against that turn-taking narratives, which are prevalent at the moment. Okay. The argument, if you look at the first chapter, is that when you believe you are turning, you have to be accountable for, or you have to understand what you are turning away and what you are turning towards. Otherwise, you will be just following the herd. Okay. And then when you are turning, take a turn, okay, you have to be aware that where this new turn takes you, what can it offer to renew your understanding? And then what is the argument? Fundamental argument is that whenever you take the turn, you have to engage critically with the previous one. I'm concerned with that non-linguistic term. When they are using this term, turn, which means I'm leaving linguistics without knowing what linguistics they are leaving, right? As a matter of fact, linguistics itself has been developing all the way. And since all are interested in human communication, we have to see the converging point. at a deeper level, right? And if that is, I think, what we can say to the present literature on translation in general, and as to how can it improve practice, this is not the purpose. We are trying to explain things. We are not going to teach people how to become a better translator. The only thing we hope we can achieve is that with such explanations, a person can be more aware of their profession and more aware of the sensitivity of using skills in turning out a text, in rendering a source text. And in this way, they can be more sensitive as a translator.
Right. We've had one more. If you want to take it in very quickly, you can. Otherwise, we have to wind up.
Cultural differences are a huge challenge in translation. Oh. I'm not a translation consultant. Okay.
Very good answer.
And then another one there. This is a political issue. I think we have got a lot of political scientists who have, got perfect answers to this question. I'm not in any position to offer any translation without hanging myself.
Very good.
Right.
That's a great answer.
But we do need to define culture whenever we talk about cultural things.
All right, very good. I'm going to wrap it up there because we are well over time. Thank you very much indeed, Chunshen. That was a wonderful presentation and as always, a very spirited Q&A. I know that we could go on for a lot longer there. I hope anyway that has inspired everybody. If some of you may well have already bought Professor Zhu's book. If you haven't, then let me encourage you to go out and buy it. Whether it is, I have to do the plug, whether it's the hard copy or you can buy the soft ebook as well if you don't want to spend so much. Anyway, I think it's really, really whetted our appetite for more, and certainly will. People should.
Yeah, but you have got, you have got my email. Any questions?
Right. Feel free to follow up any questions.
Available. Yeah.
To message with email. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you, everyone, for your attendance, for your attention, and for your questions. And your experience counts, right? Not my presentation, but your experience.
Very good. All right, great. Thanks, everybody. We'll wrap it up there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Mm-hmm.